The morning air was crisp and still carried the scent of last night's rain. The pavement slightly darkened beneath polished shoes and hurried footsteps. In the heart of a growing Seattle neighborhood, tucked between a yoga studio and a plant-based bakery, stood a coffee shop so achingly trendy it seemed to breathe ambition. Pale wood interiors, concrete countertops, and minimalist decor announced to every customer that this was not just a place for caffeine. It was a place for people who were going somewhere. It was just past 8 when Lillian Rose stepped inside, unnoticed at first. She moved without fanfare, the soft click of her low-heeled shoes drowned out by the rhythmic hiss of espresso machines and the hum of conversation about startup pitches, investor decks, and product market fit. Her appearance did not demand attention. She wore a simple beige coat, cinched at the waist with a cream scarf tucked gently beneath the collar. Her brown hair fell in clean waves past her shoulders, parted neatly, and her face was bare of makeup. Not out of neglect, but by choice, by habit. In her left hand, she carried a leather folder worn at the edges, clasped firmly against her side like something that mattered more than it looked. She paused for only a moment just inside the threshold, her eyes scanning the room. Most tables were occupied. Laptops open, glasses half full, faces lit by blue light and morning ambition. She chose a small table near the front window and quietly took her seat, arranging her folder, a small notebook, and a fountain pen on the table with a precision that suggested calm, not anxiety. She checked her watch once briefly and then folded her hands in her lap. No one approached her, no greetings, no glances. The barista behind the counter, a young woman with blue streaks in her hair and a shirt that said, "Stay grounded," glanced up, then back down, assuming she was just another loiterer waiting for someone else to buy her a drink. A man in a fitted navy blazer brushed past her table on his way to the counter and gave her a side glance, the kind people give to someone they've decided isn't important. Lillian remained composed. She didn't reach for her phone, didn't fidget, didn't scan the room nervously. She simply sat, occasionally lifting her eyes to the street beyond the window, watching pedestrians pass with the vague attentiveness of someone used to being both observer and invisible. There was a quiet grace in her stillness. Not the frozen kind born of fear, but the intentional kind that comes from knowing one's place, even when others have forgotten it. A few minutes passed. The volume in the cafe rose slightly as a group of co-founders huddled in the corner, laughing over a joke none of them would remember in a week. A delivery man propped open the door to bring in a stack of oat milk cartons. Lillian's presence remained unacknowledged. She reached into her coat pocket and took out a pair of reading glasses, slipping them on carefully before opening her notebook. The pages were lined with crisp, inked notes, charts, and annotations. Nothing messy, nothing last minute. She reread a few lines, underlined one, then quietly closed the notebook again. Her lips pressed together in a soft, thoughtful expression, as if reviewing not just words, but people, places, the weight of a decision to come. It was clear she wasn't a regular here. She didn't match the energy of the room, didn't project the curated chaos of creative urgency, yet nothing in her demeanor sought approval. She wasn't trying to fit in. She wasn't trying at all. She was simply present. And that presence, if anyone had cared to notice, Gina Mine carried a different kind of gravity. Not loud, not flashy, but real. And yet, no one asked if she'd like a drink. No one asked if she had a meeting. No one offered a menu or a smile. As far as the cafe was concerned, she was background. Furniture. But that would soon change. Because Lillian wasn't here for coffee. She was here to watch, to evaluate, to decide. And what no one in the room realized, not the barista, not the regulars on their third round of caffeine-fueled confidence, not even the cafe's manager currently joking at the counter, was that the future of their beloved space, their trendy haven of productivity and kombucha-fueled brainstorming, sat quietly at the window, in a beige coat, with a folder that held far more than paper, with a name none of them remembered, but one they would never forget. It was nearly 8:45 when a shift in the energy of the cafe signaled the arrival of someone accustomed to being at the center of things. Samantha Monroe pushed through the glass door with a swish of her camel wool coat, sunglasses still perched atop her sleek ponytail despite the overcast sky. She carried herself with the clipped efficiency of someone who knew she was busy, important, and being watched even when she wasn't. A former marketing executive turned cafe co-owner, Samantha had become a local figurehead for the new generation of women-led business ventures. Featured in local podcasts, small business panels, and the occasional lifestyle blog that celebrated women. Doing it all in designer boots. She moved quickly toward the counter, exchanging a double air kiss with the barista, and offering a well-timed laugh to a regular who complimented her scarf. Her hands fluttered through the air with practiced familiarity as she gave instructions to the staff. Something about the angle of the table signs not matching the brand aesthetic, and then reached for her drink, already waiting for her in a ceramic to-go cup, her name printed in perfect block letters. She didn't notice Lillian at first. Or perhaps she did and dismissed her without registering it, the way people sometimes filter out soft sounds when walking into a noisy room. But it didn't take long. Samantha had a meeting scheduled that morning, an informal catch-up with someone from the foundation, she'd said, when relaying it to her partner the week before. Just a routine check-in, she'd shrugged. Nothing big. And she had, of course, assumed the representative would be older, stuffier, someone with horn-rimmed glasses and a clipboard, someone she could charm or impress or redirect, depending on the needs of the moment. She hadn't imagined her to be a young woman in a plain coat, sitting quietly by the window like she belonged to no one and nothing. Her eyes swept the room, landed on Lillian, paused, narrowed. A moment of uncertainty flickered behind her expression before being smoothed out by the easy confidence that came with years of soft power and practiced authority. With her coffee in hand and a tight, bright smile, Samantha crossed the cafe. "Hi there," she said in the slightly elevated tone people use when speaking to someone they think might be confused or lost. "Can I help you with something? This table is usually reserved for meetings." Lillian looked up slowly, folding her notebook with a deliberate calm that seemed to absorb the air around her. She adjusted her glasses, then met Samantha's gaze with a poise that made her seem older than she was. "You must be Samantha Monroe," she said, her voice low and clear, her accent hard to place. Neutral, refined, effortless. "I'm Lillian Rose. We had a meeting scheduled this morning at 8:30. Samantha's smile faltered, just slightly. "Oh," she said, blinking once, then quickly recovering. "Right, from the, what was it again? Oak something fund?" "Oak Ridge," Lillian replied gently. "Women-led Ventures Initiative. You signed our participation agreement 8 months ago, and this check-in is part of the year-end review process." There was no edge in her tone, no accusation, no annoyance. Just clarity, and it unsettled Samantha more than indignation might have. She hesitated, searching for a response that would reassert control over the interaction, then glanced around as if hoping to find a staff member to whom she could delegate the problem. "Right, well," she said with a chuckle that sounded just a touch too forced. "I wasn't sure you were... you didn't exactly check in with anyone." "I arrived on time and waited," Lillian said simply. "No one approached me." Samantha laughed lightly again and took a sip of her coffee. "It's been a hectic morning," she said. "Lots going on. We're actually prepping for an event this afternoon. Investor Visibility Day. You know how it is." Lillian didn't respond to that. She simply glanced at the chair across from her, then back to Samantha, as if to say, "Sit. Or don't. It's your choice." Samantha hesitated, then tilted her head slightly. "Actually, would you mind moving this to the back patio? We've got a few things scheduled for this area." "I'd prefer to stay inside," Lillian said. "It's quite cold." Samantha blinked again. The smile on her face had become glassy, mechanical. "It's not about the cold," she said. "It's just, this is a customer-facing space. You understand?" "I'm not a customer," Lillian said. "I'm an equity auditor." And that was the moment, the turn, the quiet shift in power that Samantha didn't recognize until it was already happening. She opened her mouth to respond, but something in Lillian's tone, something unshakably calm, made her stop. She studied the young woman more closely now. The confident posture, the tidy materials, the subtle but undeniable presence of someone who wasn't trying to be impressive but simply was. Then, without warning, Samantha turned, gesturing sharply toward the counter. "Jules," she called, "can you bring a cloth or something? We've got someone spilling ink or something over here." Lillian glanced down at her own table. Everything was clean, nothing had spilled, but a moment later Jules, the barista, came over with a rag and looked at Lillian with a mix of confusion and mild irritation. "There's nothing to clean," Lillian said quietly, meeting Jules's eyes with a small, respectful nod. Thank you anyway. And then it happened. Samantha, laughing nervously now, raised her coffee cup for another sip, but her hand jerked slightly, too quickly, too close. And the next second, the entire contents of the cup splashed forward across the edge of the table onto Lillian's folder and coat sleeve. It happened fast, but not so fast that it couldn't be felt. The sting of the heat, the sudden stillness that followed. A few nearby customers turned their heads, sensing something had gone wrong, but Samantha was already reaching for napkins with exaggerated concern. "Oh my God," she said. "I'm so sorry. That was clumsy of me." Lillian stood silently. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp. She simply placed her hand over the folder which had absorbed most of the spill, and then looked down at her sleeve, where the liquid had darkened the fabric. Samantha kept talking, rapid now. "I really didn't mean... Here, let me... Jules, can we get another towel? God, what a mess." "It's all right," Lillian said, still calm. She dabbed the corner of the folder with a napkin, her movements slow, precise. But there was something behind her eyes now. Something steady and cool. Samantha's voice began to trail off. "I'm fine," Lillian said again. "Accidents happen." Then she looked up, and her expression was as composed as ever. But her eyes had changed. "You've made your impression," she said softly. And Samantha, without understanding exactly why, felt a chill crawl up her neck. Lillian didn't storm out. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand to speak to anyone. She simply collected her things, folded the damp napkins carefully, and stepped away from the table. Her coat sleeve clung to her arm, dark with coffee, and she made no attempt to hide it. She walked slowly, not toward the exit, but toward the back of the cafe, toward the hallway marked "Staff and Partners Only." She paused once, halfway there, and looked over her shoulder. Not at Samantha, but at the space itself. As if she were seeing not the room that existed, but the version of it she once believed it could become. Then she walked on. And the quiet that followed her was louder than any raised voice could have been. The back quarter of the cafe was quieter, though not exactly private. Lillian stepped through the slim doorway past a hand-painted sign that read, "Staff and Partners Only." The lettering slightly faded from steam and time. The hallway had that particular industrial feel so popular in contemporary spaces. Exposed brick, brushed steel light fixtures, concrete floor polished to a sterile sheen. There was a small shelf against one wall with backup paper menus, an extra tablet, and a potted plant someone had forgotten to water. On the far end, a frosted glass door marked "Operations" stood slightly ajar. Lillian paused for a moment, then knocked gently against the frame before stepping inside. The room beyond wasn't large, but it was designed to appear impressive. Sleek built-in cabinetry, a long walnut desk, and 2 ergonomic chairs faced a digital screen mounted on the wall. Framed certificates hung in a neat column. Business awards, community acknowledgments, a certificate of participation from an accelerator program that had since collapsed. Lillian recognized some of the names on the wall. She had once worked behind the scenes of many such ventures, helping them get their first funding, ensuring their first quarter had numbers clean enough to attract real interest. She knew what went into building momentum and, more importantly, what happened when people mistook momentum for immunity. She set her folder down on the desk, opened it carefully, and pulled out 3 documents. Her fingers worked with the confidence of someone who had read these same pages dozens of times, marked them, revised them, understood them not just as paperwork but as architecture. These were not passive documents. They were structures, legal and strategic, designed to create opportunity but also accountability. From behind her, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the narrow hallway. Samantha appeared at the door, her face flushed, not with remorse but with irritation held barely in check. There was a tremor of forced politeness in her voice when she spoke. "You really shouldn't be back here," she said, folding her arms. "That space is for internal team use." Lillian didn't turn. "I'm here in my capacity as a review officer. The documentation I'm carrying includes full access permissions, including for non-public areas, during scheduled audits." She tapped the top page lightly with her index finger. "It was in the agreement your team signed." Samantha blinked. She didn't like being corrected, especially not like this. Not by someone whose clothes weren't expensive, whose hair wasn't sprayed into position. She stepped into the room with quick, clipped strides, her voice tightening like a drawstring. You know, this really isn't the way we do things here. If you had issues, you could have rescheduled. You didn't have to turn this into some sort of power play. Lillian turned now slowly, deliberately. There is no power play, she said. There is only procedure. Samantha exhaled sharply and walked past her to stand behind the desk, as if placing a physical barrier between them would somehow re-establish her authority. She glanced down at the documents Lillian had laid out and frowned, skimming the headers with narrowed eyes. These are drafts, she said. They're live, Lillian corrected. Pre-approved templates, populated with your data, compiled over the last 2 quarters. You received a notice last week about our intent to initiate a risk assessment. You acknowledged it by email. I didn't read the attachments, Samantha muttered. I know, Lillian replied. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Outside the room, a coffee grinder screamed into life before fading again into the buzz of mid-morning business. Samantha's hands curled at her sides. I've got a cafe to run, she said finally. And if you're here to lecture me about some checklist nonsense, I'm going to stop you right now. We've been busy. We've grown. Our reviews are solid. We've hit every public target we set. Lillian remained still. Your external metrics look promising, yes. But there have been red flags. Internal attrition, several anonymous complaints, breakdowns in management communication. Today was a field validation. Observation, review, interaction. Samantha scoffed. So I spilled some coffee. That's what this is about? Lillian didn't flinch. That incident will be documented, yes, but not because of the spill. Samantha stepped around the desk again. Her tone was sharper now, laced with something darker. Something defensive, brittle, familiar. Listen, she said. If this is about how I spoke to you earlier, I can apologize. I mean, we're all women here, right? No need to make this personal. Lillian tilted her head slightly. You believe that acknowledging someone as your equal is personal? That's not what I meant. Isn't it? For the first time, Samantha's expression cracked. Her eyes darted, searching for some sign of weakness. Some indication that this woman standing so calmly in front of her might be bluffing. But there was nothing. Just that steady gaze, unwavering, unthreatening, but absolute. Samantha folded her arms again, tighter this time, and exhaled through her nose. Fine, she said. You've made your point. What now? You want us to post a statement? Retrain staff? What? What's your solution? I'm not here to suggest solutions, Lillian replied. I'm here to determine whether this business still qualifies for partnership under the Foundation's standards. That's absurd, Samantha snapped. You're going to punish the entire cafe because of a misunderstanding? Lillian regarded her for a long moment. I didn't say anything about punishment, she said quietly. But our program isn't just about funding. It's about modeling leadership, culture, values. This cafe represents something more than its menu. Samantha was silent. She looked down, then away, then back again, and something in her posture shifted, subtly but unmistakably. A crack in the facade, the beginning of understanding, though not yet regret. I built this place from scratch, she said, her voice lower now. I had nothing before this, just an idea, no help. And now, Lillian said softly, you have help. Structure, access, trust. And with that comes responsibility. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the small clock above the desk. Outside the frosted glass door, the cafe moved forward without them. Coffees poured, orders called out, lives intersecting in tiny, forgettable moments. Inside the office, however, something had shifted permanently. Lillian began gathering her papers. She moved slowly, precisely, with the quiet finality of someone who knew there would be no second chances. Not because she wanted to be harsh, but because some choices simply couldn't be walked back. As she closed her folder, she glanced once more at Samantha. Not with anger, not with pity, but with a kind of sorrow. Not for what had happened, but for what had been lost. By the time Lillian stepped back into the main room of the cafe, the energy had shifted again. The early morning bustle had begun to taper off, replaced by a late morning lull where the air felt heavier, slower, filled with the low hum of jazz from the overhead speakers and the occasional hiss of steam from behind the bar. Outside, clouds rolled over the glass storefront in soft, slow motion, casting a gray wash across the polished tabletops and matte-finished tiles. She didn't return to her previous seat by the window. Instead, she stood for a moment in the open floor, taking in the space. Not as a guest, not even as an auditor, but as someone trying to understand what had been built here, what had been claimed, and what had been quietly neglected in the process. The walls were beautiful, the design impeccable. It was the kind of cafe that people posted about on Instagram, the kind of place where someone could spend $10 on a latte and feel like they were participating in a lifestyle. But beneath the aesthetic was something else. An absence. Not of service or polish, but of attention, of humility. Lillian had seen it before. She had spent years watching it happen in businesses just like this. A seed of idealism watered by ego, allowed to grow into something that looked impressive but bore no real fruit. She stepped closer to the counter, this time deliberately. The barista, Jules, looked up, her expression tense, confused. For a split second, she seemed ready to apologize, to offer something. Maybe a towel, maybe an explanation. But Lillian only offered a quiet nod. There was no accusation in it, only acknowledgement. She could tell the young woman hadn't meant harm. She was simply doing what she'd been told. That, Lillian had learned, was often the most dangerous part. When people stopped thinking for themselves and started executing instructions without question, assuming the person with the loudest voice was the one who deserved to be followed. She asked gently if she could speak to the other owner. "Do you mean Karina?" Jules asked, surprised. "She's not usually here on Wednesdays." "Could you check?" Lillian asked. "It's important." Something in her tone, quiet but firm, cut through the hesitation. Jules nodded and disappeared through a back door behind the espresso machine. Lillian waited, standing calmly, hands clasped before her. Around her, customers sipped drinks and typed emails, unaware of the deeper thread running through the cafe that morning. A few minutes passed, then the door opened again, and out stepped a woman Lillian hadn't seen before. She was shorter than Samantha, dressed more casually, but there was a steadiness in her walk, a warmth behind her eyes that didn't feel rehearsed. Karina Moreno, co-founder, co-owner, and, judging by her expression, completely unaware of what had unfolded just an hour earlier. "Miss Rose," she said, extending her hand. "I wasn't expecting you today." "No one was," Lillian said softly, accepting the handshake. "Is something wrong?" Lillian paused and then she smiled, not coldly, not triumphantly, but gently, like someone about to tell the truth, not out of cruelty, but necessity. "That depends," she said. "Do you have 10 minutes to sit with me?" Karina nodded, her curiosity outweighing any defensiveness. They took a small table near the sidewall, away from the counter, where the quiet felt more respectful. Lillian laid her folder on the table, but didn't open it right away. Instead, she looked Karina in the eye and simply began speaking. She told her what had happened. Without exaggeration, without bitterness. She described the interaction, the dismissal, the coffee, the office conversation. She spoke calmly, clinically almost, but with enough emotion to make it clear she wasn't reciting procedure. Karina listened. She didn't interrupt, and when Lillian finished, there was a long silence between them. Karina finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "She didn't know who you were, did she?" "No," Lillian said. "But that's not the problem." Karina looked down at her hands, fingers laced on the table like a student preparing to be graded. "It's not about me," Lillian continued. "It's about what she assumed I wasn't. She thought she could tell the value of a person by looking at their coat, their hair, their tone. That's not a flaw in her judgment. That's a flaw in your culture. And that," she said gently, "is something I have to account for." Karina closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded. "You're right," she said. "And I'm sorry, not just for today, for the fact that I let that kind of atmosphere take root." Lillian didn't respond right away. She watched the other woman carefully, measuring not her apology, but its weight, its truth. Then at last she opened the folder. "These are preliminary recommendations," she said, sliding the papers forward. "They're not binding yet, but they represent a direction. If we move forward with termination, the partnership agreement will dissolve within 30 days. You'll retain ownership but lose access to foundation support, mentorship, and funding continuity." Karina looked at the documents without touching them. "Is there a way back?" Lillian met her eyes. "Not to the way things were, but to something better? Maybe. If you want it badly enough." For the first time that morning, Karina didn't look like a founder. She looked like someone who understood what it meant to be responsible for more than herself. "I do," she said. "I want to fix this." "Then start today," Lillian said, standing slowly. "Start with how you lead, not with damage control, with culture." As Lillian moved toward the door, Karina followed her for a step, then stopped, unsure of what else to say. Lillian paused before exiting. She turned just slightly, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the ambient jazz. "Tell Samantha, I don't want an apology." Karina frowned. "No? I want to see who she is when no one's watching." Then she stepped out, letting the bell above the door ring once. Clean, simple, final. The following morning, Seattle's sky hung low with a steel-colored stillness that felt more like January than late fall. The cafe opened on schedule, lights flickering on one by one in the quiet hours before the first customer arrived. The espresso machines warmed slowly, the scent of roasted beans rising with comforting familiarity, as if the place itself believed everything was just another ordinary day. But beneath the surface, tension had already taken root. Staff moved differently, more careful, more watchful. Even Jules, typically bright-eyed and casual, offered only clipped words and tight nods. The mood, though unspoken, was unmistakable. Something had shifted. At precisely 9:01 a.m., Karina arrived. She didn't carry a handbag or a laptop, just a plain canvas folder under her arm. Her face held no makeup, and her usual layered accessories were absent, as if she had deliberately stripped herself of anything that might have been interpreted as performative. She nodded to the barista, declined the free coffee she was offered out of habit, and made her way toward the private office. Through the glass, Samantha was already seated at the long walnut desk, typing with visible frustration into her laptop, her nails clacking too loudly against the keys. She didn't look up when Karina entered. "We need to talk," Karina said, closing the door behind her. Samantha's fingers paused on the keyboard for only a moment before resuming. "Can it wait? I've got 5 open emails from our suppliers about today's delivery." "No," Karina said. "It can't." Something in her tone caused Samantha to lift her head. She leaned back slowly in her chair, arms crossing defensively. "All right," she said, dragging the word out. "What now?" Karina pulled out a chair across from her and sat down, placing the folder on the desk without opening it. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at her business partner, and in that silence, something happened. Not dramatic, not loud, but the air seemed to fold inward, like the pressure had changed. Samantha shifted in her seat. "I spoke with Lillian after you left," Karina began. "I asked her to stay. I needed to hear it from her directly." Samantha rolled her eyes, though her throat twitched as if preparing a retort she hadn't yet shaped into words. "And let me guess," she said. "She gave you the full sob story, how I'm some kind of monster who mistreats people." "No," Karina said. "She didn't say anything like that. She didn't have to." For a moment, Samantha didn't respond. Then she scoffed, folding her arms tighter. "I told you it was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who she was. I thought she was someone, I don't know, waiting for a friend. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't order anything. She just sat there like she owned the place." Karina's gaze remained steady. "She didn't have to introduce herself, Sam. You knew we had a foundation review scheduled this week. You ignored it. You dismissed her. And then you poured coffee on her documents." Samantha's face flushed. "That was an accident. You think I did that on purpose?" "I think," Karina said softly, "you didn't care enough to prevent it." Silence again, this time longer. Samantha looked away toward the bookshelf, then toward the window, as if trying to find a version of the story where she wasn't the problem. When she looked back, her voice was lower. "So, what happens now?" she asked. "They pull the funding?" "They could," Karina said. "We're already flagged. If Lillian escalates it, we'll be ineligible for the next grant cycle. And the board might require a formal review of all our financials, especially any that were tied to matching grants. We'd lose more than money. We'd lose standing." Samantha stood abruptly and walked toward the window, her arms dropping to her sides. She stared out into the gray morning, her breath fogging slightly on the glass. "I worked my ass off for this place," she said. "We had nothing when we started, you know that." "I do," Karina said. "I was there too." Samantha turned, and now her voice had turned brittle. "Then how can you sit there and let one person, one mistake, jeopardize everything we've built?" "Because it wasn't just one mistake," Karina replied. "It was a reflection of something you've let become part of this place. You've stopped listening to people. You've stopped seeing them. You've started performing leadership instead of practicing it." Samantha flinched slightly, as if the words had hit closer than she expected. She walked back to the desk but didn't sit. "So what, you want me to quit?" Karina shook her head. "No, I want you to decide who you are when no one's watching, because that's who you bring to work every day." Samantha looked at the folder but didn't reach for it. Her expression had changed. No longer angry, just tired. Like someone beginning to realize the ground beneath her was not as solid as she thought. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Maybe I don't know who that is anymore." Karina leaned back slightly in her chair. Her voice softened, not with pity, but with invitation. "Then figure it out before someone else figures it out for you." A knock at the door interrupted them. Jules peeked her head in. "Sorry, delivery's here. They need someone to sign." Samantha didn't move. Karina stood and nodded. "I'll take care of it." She turned toward the door but paused at the threshold. She looked back once, catching Samantha's eyes with a final clarity. "She didn't ask for an apology," she said. "She asked to see who you are when no one's watching." And then she left the room, the door clicking gently shut behind her, leaving Samantha alone with her reflection in the darkened window, surrounded by all the trappings of success. Certificates, press clippings, handcrafted mugs, and the sudden startling realization that none of it would protect her from herself. 3 days passed. The cafe continued its rhythm. Orders taken, names called out, machines hissing with reliable urgency. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss, but inside, a current of quiet unrest pulsed through the staff. Whispers about the Foundation's audit floated in hushed tones across the bar. Regular customers noticed something too, an alertness, a stiffness in the way Samantha moved, a new reserve in her voice that hadn't been there before. She had not said much since the morning Karina confronted her, but her silence wasn't resignation. It was a kind of suspension, as if she were waiting for something, though she couldn't name what. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, the door opened with the soft chime of the bell, and Lillian stepped back into the cafe. This time, she didn't pause at the threshold or choose a quiet corner. She walked directly toward the long communal table near the back, usually reserved for events, team meetings, or startup presentations. A few customers looked up as she passed, sensing something unfamiliar. She wore the same coat, the same calm, but today there was a quiet finality in the way she carried herself, like someone arriving not to negotiate, but to close. Karina appeared from behind the counter almost immediately. She approached with measured steps, a folder in one hand, her expression unreadable but not tense. There was an understanding between them now, something unspoken but mutual, a language of shared responsibility. No formalities were exchanged. Karina simply gestured toward the open seat across from her at the table, and Lillian sat. Samantha was already there. She didn't greet Lillian, didn't smile. She sat with her back straight, her fingers laced together on the table, staring down at the polished wood as though waiting to be summoned. When Lillian finally spoke, her voice was as calm as ever, but with less space for warmth. "I've finalized the report," she said. "It includes documentation from our observations, correspondence, partner feedback, and internal culture metrics. It will go to the Foundation's board tomorrow. Karina nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement. Samantha didn't move. We have the option to recommend dissolution of partnership, Lillian continued. In this case, it would be immediate. Full retraction of funding and removal from all programs and press affiliations. It's within protocol, and it would be justified. A flicker of movement passed through Samantha's jaw, but she said nothing. Karina glanced at her, then back at Lillian. And if you don't? Karina asked. Lillian folded her hands atop the folder. Then we offer conditional continuation. Subject to changes in leadership policy, a written restructuring plan, and documented evidence of compliance within the next quarter. The room seemed to hold its breath. Samantha finally spoke. Her voice was rougher than usual, not defensive, not sarcastic, just stripped of performance. And you'll be the one to check if we comply? Lillian looked at her steadily. No, I won't. Samantha raised her eyes at that. Something like surprise flashed across her face. Lillian continued. My presence is no longer necessary. What happens here won't depend on whether I'm watching. It never did. She pushed the folder slightly forward across the table, the soft scrape of paper against wood louder than it should have been. Then she stood, calmly, without ceremony. Samantha swallowed hard. Wait, she said, barely above a whisper. Lillian paused, looking at her. Not over her, not through her, but into her. Waiting, but not helping. Samantha stood slowly like someone uncertain whether they were allowed to. She glanced at Karina, who said nothing. The silence gave her no cue. It was hers to fill. I didn't see you, she said at last. Not really. I saw a coat. A chair. I saw someone who didn't belong, and I reacted from that place. Lillian didn't interrupt. I don't know what I thought I was protecting, Samantha continued. Pride, maybe. Control. But I do know what I nearly lost. Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, but she didn't break. I'm not asking you to reverse anything. I'm just asking that if this place has a chance to become better, it gets that chance. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just the sound of rain beginning again outside, steady and even against the tall windows. Lillian gave the smallest of nods. That decision was never mine alone, she said softly, but I've documented the moment. And with that, she turned and walked toward the door. As she reached it, she passed a young woman in a raincoat, holding a laptop, looking for a seat. The girl hesitated, unsure if she belonged. Lillian gave her a kind smile and a gentle nod toward the open table. Then she stepped out into the rain without raising her umbrella. The rain had stopped by the following week, leaving behind streets rinsed clean and skies that carried a brightness unfamiliar to November. The cafe opened that morning not with a grand announcement or ceremonial ribbon, but with quiet intention. The chalkboard sign outside had been changed. Where it once advertised seasonal syrups and influencer collaborations, it now read in calm, handwritten script, "Coffee begins with kindness." Inside, subtle changes had taken root. The table by the window, Lillian's table, had been moved slightly to give more space for single visitors. The staff had begun offering water to anyone who sat down, whether they ordered or not. The playlist was softer, more live piano, less curated edge. No one had been told to make these changes, not formally. They had simply begun to shift, like a house settling deeper into its foundation. Samantha still came in every day, but her role had changed. She no longer barked orders across the bar or lectured staff on brand language. Instead, she watched. She listened. Sometimes she asked questions she once would have ignored. How are you? Do you need more support? What do you think we could do better? She never mentioned Lillian again. Not in meetings, not to staff, not even to Karina. But the absence of her name hung in the air with reverence, like a bookmark pressed between chapters, holding open the memory of what had almost been lost. In place of apology, there was effort. In place of ego, reflection. Karina, meanwhile, had taken the reins of public presence. She handled the next grant report herself, not as a formality, but as an act of responsibility. She scheduled regular staff meetings, not to instruct, but to learn. For the first time in months, laughter returned to the break room, not as distraction, but as connection. The cafe hadn't changed dramatically from the outside. The countertops were still clean, the pastries still artisanal, the latte art still good. But something inside had softened, warmed, aligned. No one knew if Lillian would return. But then, one rainy afternoon, not unlike the one before everything changed, she did. She came alone as before in a light wool coat and low boots, hair loosely tucked into her collar. She didn't pause at the entrance this time. She walked straight to the counter, smiled at the young woman behind the bar, one she hadn't met, and ordered a black tea with milk. The barista smiled back and said, "It's on the house. Welcome back." Lillian took the cup and sat by the window again, not in the shadow of memory, but in quiet peace. Outside, the rain began again, just lightly enough to beat against the glass. She opened her notebook, not for inspection, but for herself. A few lines, a sketch, a note about what could grow from the right kind of discomfort. A young man at the next table dropped his phone. Lillian picked it up and handed it to him with a soft smile. He nodded his thanks, then turned back to his laptop. Nothing extraordinary happened, but everything felt different, and sometimes that is the point.